And the point of this is to help relatively experienced activists to think about what they are doing beyond their individual organization. So to understand the role of their organization within their movement, and indeed the role of their movement in social change. So this is quite abstract stuff in a sense, but it's also crucial if we are serious about changing a system and not simply changing one thing. It does become abstract, it does become complex, as I think many of you know from your own experience. It's not as straightforward as it might seem at the start. So I'll explain a little bit and then I'll get us doing an activity with Hale's assistance and then we'll come back and discuss it. Um, in research on social movements, we make a really important distinction between an organization and a movement. And this is complicated because quite often organizations call themselves movements. But what we say in research is that a social movement is the network of relationships between formal organizations, informal groups, and individuals. Yeah. So it's bigger than any one organization. It's bigger than any one individual. It's bigger than any one group. And therefore, it is quite a fuzzy thing. It's quite a complicated thing. But if we imagine that the organization we are in is the movement, we are going to get quite confused quite quickly about any larger scale form of social change. And of course, it will be quite difficult to collaborate if we go in with the assumption that we are the real movement and everybody else somehow isn't real. Because, of course, each of us understands ourselves to be real, not only as individuals, but in our organizing activity, in our activism. So, the exercise we're going to do, some of you might have done it before, is an exercise in movement mapping. So it's an exercise in seeing what is happening in the movement we're in. Let me show you briefly to give a sense of what this looks like. Is that visible there? You see that okay?
Yep, we can see it.
So a colleague of mine, Sharmeen Khan, did this for Palestine Solidarity in Toronto. And you don't need to know all the details to see that there are some things which are larger, more powerful, organizations, networks, types of organization even. Some are smaller. They are color coded because some of them have different kinds of strengths, different kinds of, they mobilize different social groups, they engage in different kinds of activity. And then you also draw lines to show the strength of the relationships between them, whether they're positive or negative relationships. So that's the kind of activity, yeah. And you don't need to you don't need to know the details to see the kind of thing it is. So can I ask you perhaps to react with a raised hand or something like that, an emoji, if you've done this, if you've done this kind of activity before? A few people, yeah. Okay. So, when you do this formally, it can take a long time. We're just going to do a little taster just so that we can have a discussion. Yeah. And I'll pass over maybe to Hales and Bia to set up the groups, and then we have questions for those groups in English and translated into French. That was a very short dip into what can be a very big exercise. But I wonder if any of the groups actually came up with responses or what kinds of issues came up for you in discussing it, what your questions were, what your thoughts were, if you refused the questions altogether. So what happened?
Hi. Um, One thing that we talked about, which I thought was really, really good advice, was collaboration between the groups. I'm a member of quite a few smaller groups, um, locally as well as globally, and a like a calendar of all the different groups, all of the different ways in which we can stay connected with one another. I think that was something that was really evidently in our conversation was something really important, that a way for us to all connect to one another so that we've always got something, and not feeling guilty about, we are doing something, we are actually here, and be proud of that. I'm dying to hear other people's, so please definitely put your hand up.
Angelo, fine.
Um, During the breakout room, I had really, I had a difficulty in seeing other organizations as friends, or possible allies, because um, what I said during the breakout room is that anybody who doesn't push as hard as you it's sort of like a reformist, right? It's like they're part of the problem. So, like, how could you possibly see, if you know this, then how could you possibly see them as an ally? I mean, they become an ally if they do what you do, right? Which is probably not what what you want us to learn from this. But um, yeah, it's difficult to see, right? To sort of say, okay, can I trust you? I mean, your intentions are good, but you're completely out of like the ballpark.
Laurie.
So I was talking before I accidentally ejected myself from our small group. I was talking about how with the start of the genocide in Palestine, there was a much more radical coalition of organizations that came together. However, the focus was not on climate, but we did all come together around that shared goal, which was to stop the genocide. There were organizations there that, Extinction Rebellion does not agree with in terms of tactics. We're a nonviolent organization. And there were people there who definitely advocated, by whatever means necessary here in the US. Um, And the coalition that's built up now since the election of Trump is much more reformist. So we don't align with them on some political goals, but those organizations are creating, they're bringing people together, they're getting people out on the streets, they're creating an opportunity for us to get our messaging out there. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to come together with organizations on things that we align with, while trying to bring and trying to figure out at this point how to bring climate messaging to the actions that are happening. So, and if anybody has ideas about that, I'd love to hear them.
I get Angelo, what he was saying about that concept, that you're like, you look at the people in the street and you go, why are you not doing anything? It's clearly obvious that we need to do something, man. We need to get out there. You should be out there protesting, whatever thing that's really drawing us at that moment in time. But I realize that not everybody has, it's like eating garlic. This is my example, which is like when you're a kid, you don't like garlic, but as you go a bit older, you like garlic. And so some people come to activism slowly. They slowly get involved with something which is maybe not as activistic, maybe not quite out there, maybe not throwing paint. You know what? But they start at the bottom, maybe at the bottom, just in a community garden or in a repair cafe. But then something grabs them. And if they start somewhere, then we have people coming through the organization. So to be collaborative for all groups and they recognize that everybody has their part in the organization, I think is really important.
Yeah.
I think that Cien, or you were before me.
I have already spoken once, so you feel free to go
Nice.
first.
I think that like it's more a general reflection that I have and doubts. But when I think about different actors in a network, I think that, yeah, especially considering the environmental movement, but also the pro-Palestinian one, and generally the progressive side. Well, it's difficult for me because I think that most of the time these groups are made of the same people. So it's really difficult to tell that they are covering a different niche, because the identity is really quite homogeneous. So they are not getting in touch with different communities and parts of society. And I think that, yeah, but I don't know if it's a question or a reflection, but I think that this is my difficulty in what I'm doing.
Can I just come in? Michael here. Yeah, I mean, I've been an activist, a serious activist, since 2019. First with XR, then with also JSO, and on the streets as well. I've been involved in occupations of cathedrals and council buildings and state buildings, so to say. Yeah, and we've gained some success in that way of occupations, in attracting people to go into what we call people's assemblies, which has been always been very fruitful. When people come together, they can really make a great deal of change, and that's so inspirational. But the big factor we have in the UK at the moment, and I've talked about this to my group briefly, is that we are being policed to extinction. We have repressive laws given to us by the government, which prevent us from protesting in what we would call traditional protesting. We're not even allowed to do that. So, for example, 2 days ago, the movement in Palestine, the Palestine Action Movement, was declared a terrorist organization. So that puts them on the par with Al Qaeda, and other terrorist groups. So Here we have a system of repression, which our judges are on the side of the establishment, and they're following establishment doctrine, not giving protesters any kind of rights whatsoever. So it's really quite a serious situation. But I just want to very quickly now touch on that one about Palestine and also the climate movement, because what we experience also in which I think is a mistake. I totally understand the situation, and I'm appalled what's happening in Palestine. But my focus primarily is on the climate and nature crisis. And what we have right now, we have that many people now from the climate movement are moving to Palestine Action, well, they've moved to it. So we're bereft. The climate movement here is pretty down on its feet, but the Palestine Action is very high in activist engagement. I just want to draw your attention to what happened today in Texas. Over 100 people dead, many young girls still missing. And I also want to just draw your attention to what the United Nations said this week, that our biggest battle is climate change. That is our biggest war. So we're on a bit of on the floor here a bit on the climate movement. I'm just hoping we can get together and go forward in a way. Okay, that's all I've got to say about that issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Sylvia.
Building on this, I'm also based in the UK. I'm based in London, and I agree that at the moment the biggest movement is the Palestinian movement that might have taken away resources from other movements, but I start seeing people, these groups, these movements are coming together and starting realizing that it's just the Palestinian issue or the climate change issue, but also other more domestic issues like poverty in the UK. They are just a part, they are just different faces of the same issue, that is the need to dismantle the capitalist society. And what I've seen recently, like last week, I was at a very niche, small protest in a neighborhood here in London, in North London, and that was organized by the Palestine Solidarity Campaign branch of Islington in North London. But that that march, that little protest, was specifically to campaign against Barclays, because Barclays invests in genocide, but Barclays invests also in fossil fuels. So on that occasion, there were other groups from the climate change and environment in general, environment space, and not only that, there were groups on the banking in a different way. I don't remember their names, but it was about taking down the big corporates, including banks, to work, and the aim of that was to work all together for the same scope, that is bringing down these people, which are creating a lot of issues for everyone. So it's a really small, but some narrative around how everything is connected is starting. And I think that what the government is doing here is actually doing a big favor to all the movements on the left, because inside the Palestine movement, of course, what happened with Palestine Action last week has just glued the movement all together, even more. But the banning of Palestine Action is not just, well, of course, it's because they were too effective, but it creates a precedent that can be really bad for every type of movement. So I think that in this very hard and dark times, I think that this can also be an opportunity for everyone to come together. And probably the more the government will do this, and they will, the more people can come together from different angles, different movements, different perspectives, and work together for the same aim, that at the end is dismantling the capitalist system and replacing it with something different. It will take time. It's just the beginning, but I want to be hopeful.
Great, thanks. Could we maybe take Rowan first, because Sien, you've already said something, and then Sien, and then if there's anyone else who hasn't said anything yet. Rowan. You're muted.
A key method or issue, if you like, for me and the groups that I'm involved with are non-violence. Just Stop Oil and Insulate Britain both are explicitly non-violent. By explicitly, I mean they have it written on their websites and they claim it in their press releases, and you know, sort of written all over it. It's quite interesting what's been happening with Palestine Action, because they, as far as I'm aware, they've never declared themselves explicitly to be non-violent. But I suspect that if you ask the people who are taking part in Palestine Action, they'd probably say, yes, it's non-violent, which is kind of interesting. You know, I think that and you know, they've been branded as a terrorist group, and since then a number of celebrities and different people have popped up and said, but they're non-violent, even though the organisers themselves, I think, would probably say that they're, or probably would have said they're not non-violent, or they don't explicitly say they're non-violent. So I'm just very interested in the use of the word non-violent, because most groups probably would want to be non-violent, but wouldn't explicitly have it there up front on the websites and so on. And yet, my perception of the value of non-violence is that a lot of the power of non-violence comes from being explicit about it. So it's like, as soon as you, it's almost like a magic word. As soon as you say the word non-violent, you know, people have vaguely heard maybe about Martin Luther King or Gandhi, and they can sort of relate to it in that way. Of course, there's lots of other groups that have been non-violent, but those are the ones that most people have, or many people at least have heard of. And so you kind of get to lean into their power. Their power kind of comes to the fore, and you start to be able to act with their power sort of behind you. And also that non-violence can create a kind of a shield that stops you from being called terrorist. So, for example, Just Stop Oil has done property damage actions, but because it claims to be non-violent, I suspect because it claims to be non-violent and because it's accountable for those actions, they've never been able to stick a terrorist label on Just Stop Oil. And so, yeah, I'm just interested to know what people think about that. You know, I personally think it's really important to be explicit about it. But what do other people think? And, you know, what are the implications of that for an ecology of movements?
Okay. And Cien, and then I might move this on. That's okay. Sorry, is that the right way to pronounce it?
Yep, perfect. Um, just I wanted to just say about, because if I don't mention it, my friend Rachel Gambling's going to kill me. Intersectionality, telling people about why you're doing this, what you're doing this for, where does it fit in within all the different hierarchies of the world. Everything is intersected. It's like people that say they want to be apolitical. There is no such thing. Even taking that stance in of itself is apolitical, and it can tell a lot about a person just from those short few words. And with like nonviolence, again, it's yes, it is. You have to be clear and conscious about what that means to be nonviolent, and showing that to people, explaining that to people. And I think for a lot of it, I've learned from Rachel Gambling about intersectionality, and I really recommend it to so many people. I recommend it to so many people about it. That's all I want to say. Thank you. I'm getting nervous now. Bye.
Great, thank you. So let me say just, I'll talk for maybe 10 minutes and then we've got the rest of the time for questions, answers, comments. But just to kind of build up from this exercise or this little attempt at an exercise to the notion of an ecology of social movements and then to what we know empirically. So I think that Bea and Hales will share the full tool with you in case you found it useful. But the idea is literally to start with an empirical mapping of what is happening in the movement beyond our own organization. And of course, as you see, that immediately throws up a question of what is the movement in terms of issue, geography. You also start to see divergences within the movement, frustrations, all sorts of problems and complexities. And I will say, in a time of increasing repression in several people's states, it can also be really helpful to ask yourself, how do other groups within the movement see my group? If my group is banned, repressed, or whatever, who else will come out to support it? Is often a very, very important question. So I'll just say that. But that's what the tool is. It's a very empirical mapping. Yeah, what exists. Not what should exist, not what we think other people should be doing, but what do we and other people do? And we often use the metaphor of an ecology of social movements because we can hardly imagine that the tree and the moss on the rotting tree that's fallen, and the beetle in the moss, and the rabbit, and the hawk, they don't all see things the same way. Yeah? Very literally. They do not see and experience things the same way. Like us individually, but also like our organizations, we center ourselves and we center our own way of thinking. But if we think about any ecology, we certainly see there are problems with boundaries. Yeah. Ecologies typically don't have very, very tight boundaries. They blur into each other, they overlap, they intersect. But they are composed of relationships between many different kinds of being. Yeah. Plants, animals, fungi. Yeah. Yeah. You know this. Yeah, I'm not saying anything very useful or very new there. But if you think of this in terms of the climate movement, for example, or the Palestine solidarity movement, if it's easier to look at a different organization or a different movement, rather. Sorry, I'm tired. You see that this is true for other movements, and sometimes you can see it's true for your own. Yeah, there are big movements, there are small movements, there are other groups that we are quite close to and groups that we are in conflict with, that we disagree with fundamentally. And some of them have different resources. Yeah. Some of them are good at reaching the media. Some of them are good at disruption. Some of them have high institutional legitimacy. Some are good at activist care, at bringing up examples. So there's a diversity of kinds of group, kinds of organization within the movement, and different relationships within that movement. And as several people have said in relation to Palestine, between movements. This is not a clear-cut thing. And in fact, it's something that in many spaces people are discussing. Are these two separate movements, perhaps in competition for activists? Are they two different ways of organizing around the same thing? Are they in alliance, for example, against repression and criminalization and for a different kind of world? Yeah. So it's not totally obvious, but a sort of systematic reflection on where my group is, what my group is like, what it's good at, what it's not good at, how it relates positively and negatively to other groups, and how they see us can be quite helpful strategically. Yeah. And it is the difference between saying the entire world is, the A22 network and everything else, for example, or, well, we're part of a bigger climate movement, we have a particular role in the movement, and so on. So yes, Marion has a question there in the chat. It's a very good one. How do we use this in our groups beyond the activity itself? And this, of course, is why it takes 3 hours or more, is if you do it systematically, if you start engaging in research, so if you sit down with comrades in a local group or nationally, it takes a while. You find it really takes time because then you say, there's this, and there's this, and that's important. A lot comes up. And then you start saying, well, who's strong? Who's weak? What are their different qualities? Where are their close relationships? Who always works together? Who refuses to work together? So that exercise doesn't dictate a strategy, but it's actually quite hard to have a strategy if you don't have a map of where you are. Yeah. And that's true both for the organization within the movement and then for the movement as a whole in relation to other movements. So it's a quite useful collective activity, especially in times where it's not clear that there's an immediate action you can do that will have a clear outcome to say, where are we? Who are we? And then the question, what do we want to do next, can appear a bit more clearly. It's not that you've brought in new information really that you didn't have, but so it's a tool for thinking about it systematically. Does that make sense? Okay. So they'll share that PDF with you, I think, at the end. So I'll say one last thing, and then there's time for questions, comments, and so on. We do actually know, as social science researchers, quite a lot about successful forms of system change in the past. Yeah? Because the world as it is now is not the world as it was. And one important player in that has been our own social movements over the last 250 years. Yeah. So movements for democracy, movements for women's rights, LGBTQ plus rights, movements for welfare states, movements for independence from empire, and so on, and so on, and so on. Yeah. There have been a lot of them. Their effects are complex, often ambiguous, but there is no sensible way of telling the history of the last 250 years that excludes them. The example that interests me most in relation to large-scale system change is the end of European empires, particularly in Asia. So I'm interested in this for two reasons. One is 60% of our species live in Asia. Yeah. The human species is Asian, and everything else is a kind of little add-on, more or less. But also, in 1900, almost all of Europe, Asia, and Africa, if you looked at an atlas or a globe, was painted in a very small number of colors. So the color of the British Empire, the color of the French Empire, the Dutch Empire, the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, you know how it goes. And then between basically 1945 and 1975, those were swept away across Asia and Africa. So that is probably the single largest historical change that has been brought about with input from social movements. Yeah, social movements played a really key role in that. And you went from these dynastic empires spanning the globe to independent nation states, of which there were very, very few in 1900 outside of the Americas. Gorian, what was swept away was European empires. Yeah? Thanks. Thanks, Mariam. So it's quite a useful example to reflect on. And I just wanted to pick out a few things that we know about those. So one is that almost all the processes towards independence or liberation from empire involved multiple different movements. Yeah. Typically peasant movements, workers' movements, middle-class nationalist movements, often religious movements, all sorts of other things, yeah? There were a lot. There was not one single movement that did it in most countries. And in fact, within those movements, there was often extreme diversity. Yeah. Most of those movements were not homogeneous and monolithic. Peasants were really complicated people. We don't think of them that way, but they were very, very different in so many ways. They organized in so many different ways. And they disagreed an awful lot. Yeah. Even while they kept on saying unity is really important, in fact, furious arguments and internecine like conflict between groups was absolutely normal. Two other things that are worth knowing. One is there was no single magical path to independence. So if you think of India and China as examples, they are not the same. There is no sensible way of talking about them which says there was one magic route to end of European empire, to national liberation. Of course, they were starting from different contexts, but that is true across Africa and Asia. Yeah, there were many different routes to the end of empire, which can be quite hopeful if we're in a situation where we think that there is only one possible way forward. Last point, even a single generation before independence, it was totally not clear what the future would look like. Yeah? Often it was not clear that independence was even possible. An end to empire didn't always seem possible, but certainly the shape of the future world was really very, very hard to grasp. And that, I think, as well, is potentially hopeful for us, or at least potentially liberating, just as an empirical observation. So the situation is not the same, obviously, but it can be worth knowing that just significance of diversity and complexity of movements and unpredictability of outcomes when thinking about our current situation. So that's what I wanted to say by way of input. And then to say, if you've got questions or comments, se volete chiedere qualcosa in italiano, I think we've also got Marian, your English is better than my Norwegian, but yeah. Comments, questions, thoughts, discussion. Rowan.
Yeah, I'd just like to ask you if you well, just to go back on what you were talking about. I think it's interesting that if you go back in way back in history, we don't really know to what extent groups used concepts like nonviolence in a kind of explicit way up until, I suppose, Thoreau in the US and Gandhi, and maybe there were others as well. But I just wondered if you could, do you see a problem for movement ecology in terms of groups like Just Stop Oil or any other group for that matter using nonviolence explicitly? Do you see that as a potential barrier with other groups? Because if so, it feels really important to identify that.
Gosh. So I think when you were speaking earlier, Rowan, particularly in the smaller group, I thought there were two components to what you were saying. And one was the commitment to nonviolence, and the other was the commitment to civil disobedience, so to disruptive actions. Yeah, and those are clearly both important.
Yeah.
And as you know, there are then groups which are non-violent but not disruptive.
Mm-hmm.
Most environmental organizations.
Well, no, this is interesting. I mean, I guess I don't know whether I would sort of have to say that
Okay.
I'm working with a particular definition of nonviolence, which I think would be in line with Gandhi and Martin Luther King, which is a nonviolence that incorporates in it a confrontational edge,
Yeah.
a disruptive edge,
Yeah.
and that something like, say, for example, a silent vigil, although it might be a wonderful thing to do,
Yeah.
peaceful thing to do, I would argue that the confrontational edge of that in most circumstances wouldn't be very strong. I can imagine that it could be strong, but in most circumstances I wouldn't see that as very strong. And so I would generally be inclined to rule that out of that particular definition of nonviolence that includes confrontation or disruption. And I think that's where it's that definition that I'm interested in, because it's there that I think the conflict most exists. Because if you're having disruption from a non-violent group, such as Just Stop Oil, you've got this very strong disruptive element, and that if there's anything violent that happens, or that would be perceived as violent by the public, um, it upstages the non-violence. It's like there's a sort of
Hmm.
there's a space in which it's almost like a theatre. There's a space which can grab the attention, and if the action is more militant, that will upstage the non-violent level of disruption. And so
Okay.
the two things can't work in parallel. And
So,
so to my mind, this is where there's a conflict
yeah,
uh, in
yeah.
groups that are using
Yeah.
disruption.
So, look, conflict is normal in movements.
Yeah.
People disagree.
Sure.
They disagree about what non-violence means.
Yeah.
They disagree, and that then adds extra complication to the conflict. Is we both say we're non-violent, but we mean different things by it.
Yeah.
But also we actually disagree with each other. I want to say that is quite normal.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yes, but there still needs to
Yeah.
be some way of resolving it in terms of how it plays out on the streets.
So what I will say is you can never hope to resolve it without building good relationships with other groups. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because you can arrive at a point where you can say to people, if you want to do that thing, please do it there.
Mhm.
Or can we do this in a way so that the thing that we are doing is not undermining the thing that you are doing?
Yeah.
But that depends on seeing each other and finding ways of saying, we do disagree about this, and we agree about the bigger goal. And what do we do about that? Which, sometimes that conversation is easier than others, isn't it?
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's a difficulty in terms of time and space.
Yes.
And so, for example, if I think about the big mass mobilization in Seattle in 1999, which was
Yeah.
the most extraordinary display of non-violence I've ever seen in the face of extreme violence from the police. And in the outer perimeter of Seattle, there was an agreement with the organizers that the Black Bloc would do property damage on the outer perimeter. So there was an agreement in terms of, I think there may also have been an agreement that it would only happen in the evening. I'm not sure about that, but that, so there was an agreement of a space element. But ever since Seattle, uh, the anti-globalization movement then would no longer agree that kind of geographical space agreement. The anti-globalization movement following Seattle wanted to have this diversity of tactics where everybody
Mhm.
does everything in the same space.
Mhm.
So, you can have an agreement, and then I guess it can break down, can't it? And it seems to be very difficult
Mhm.
to get the agreement in time and space over something like non-violence. I mean,
It is.
I'm very optimistic about the possibility of making this workable. That's
Mhm.
why I came to the discussion, because I feel hopeful about that. But it is, it just feels like it's very prickly, actually, and I think if you don't acknowledge that there's a prickliness to it, then
Mhm.
you're not gonna find a way past those prickles, as it were. Um,
I
and
think you have to, so
no, go on.
you have to be able to have really hard and honest conversations with other people in which you hold who you are and what your principles are while recognizing that they are doing exactly the same thing, which is quite difficult. And even then, it doesn't work. But as you say, when it does work, the results are often quite impressive. But, coalition building is hard. Coalition building is a real skill. And it also involves, to some extent, reshaping the organization so that you are capable of doing it, depending on the organization. Yeah. But this kind of exercise and this way of thinking is geared towards that. Is geared towards saying, how can we make alliances that do not involve us denying your right to exist, saying we're not going to talk to you because we don't agree with what you're doing, but rather saying we disagree and yeah. Yes, and indeed. There.
Yeah, considering the examples that you brought, I wonder if the problem now with the climate movement, especially, is that we don't have a clear common goal. So we have a frame, we have a huge problem that it's common, but it's difficult to have a clear goal and to make a big strategy around that so that each group and organization and whatever can align through that goal and direction and choose its strategy. And again, I wonder if this is also why we are not finding different identities, as you said, peasants and workers and religious people and so on. Because I think that most of the conflicts between climate groups are about resources because we are always trying to target the same people and so it's it's obvious because you want to mobilize the same people and you are in a scarcity attitude where you don't have enough people, you don't have enough money because you ask money always to the same people and so on. So yeah, I just wanted to ask you if you agree that it could be a problem of goals, or yeah, what's your reflection?
So I think I can see an easier answer to your second question, which is yes, it's a sign of a weak and usually declining movement when we're competing in the same space for the same people and not able to reach out beyond that. So if you leave aside the specifics of the goals, the kinds of alliances that have come together, for example, around climate jobs in Norway a decade or so back, or about just transition, or some of the more interesting versions of Green New Deal. Leave aside the value of those goals, but what you see each of them doing is bringing together different actors, is saying, how can we have unions, environmentalists, religious or faith groups quite often? How can we bring in different kinds of actors? And how can we do it in a way that enables action to happen in workplaces, in communities, in universities? And then you are no longer so much competing with one another in a shrinking space. You've got more of a common interest in building out in your different areas. Now, I'm not taking from that that is the right goal, in terms of what was framed, but to look for ways of framing the goal that enable that. So going back to Seattle, for example, and the anti-globalization movement, which I was, very involved in organizing in Ireland, one of the most useful phrases there was one no, many yeses. And we used this term neoliberalism not really as a term of economic analysis at all, but to mean this system that majority world groups are against for one reason, and that ecological groups are against for another reason, and that unions are against for another reason, and that feminist groups are against for another reason. So we actively looked for uh, a way of bringing together diversity in a shared direction. And this is what people have tried to do as well at the moment with terms like climate justice or degrowth. That in some ways, that's the political use of those and that's really kind of how to measure them. In my situation, does this enable an alliance which is radically pushing for a different system and brings together very different actors? So, which is hard work, yeah. And we often go at it the wrong way because often there's one bright person who says, this is my favorite phrase, and I'm going to convince everybody else to line up behind me. And that's not how it works. How it works is you come together and you try and find a language that you can all recognize yourselves in enough to work together. In English, we say this is easier said than done, but it is potentially something which radical climate groups do have the scope um, to exercise some leadership in. Yeah. Because of the sort of really broad framing, it's not impossible to use that as a basis for inviting others to a conversation. And for thinking, who do we need in this alliance? I can say perhaps I just spent the last 5 days in Leiden in the Netherlands with a group of people from different climate movements and climate scientists talking about this very thing. And it was difficult, but also you could see the scope for reaching more of a shared agreement than it might seem with the time and the effort. Obviously, a small group of people, but it was a positive experience, I will say, in those terms.
Sorry, I'm just doing a technical intervention. It's 9:06, and so the session is finished, but we are giving extra 30 minutes as usual. So I just want to make it explicit that if somebody needs to go, you can go, and thank you for joining. And if you want to stay, yeah, we are making an extra session now.
Do you want to just open up for questions, or how did you imagine that? Yeah, really interesting conversation because I guess my sort of engagement with the climate movement started actually with the Battle of Seattle, and that's very interesting that that came up now. And it feels like it's so much harder to find kind of a common framework, also because I feel like a lot of sort of the unions that were part of it, you had sort of like anti, you sort of nationalist people also in that, and so it was a very fragile coalition, and I feel like unions especially, I think, are very um very difficult. In Norway we have a split movement with the unions, where we have a lot of unions just wanting to drill baby drill, and then there are a minority of unions who want an energy transition. And so I find unions, not necessarily an ally at all. They often can be the most sort of recalcitrant, and then it's sort of the question of welfare. So it feels like the climate movement is like this really small group of people that feels like everybody is against it because it's the sort of welfare, social welfare work, sort of the coalition of those that may want to maintain feels so much stronger. And it seems as if it gets more desperate the more extreme the breakdown becomes. It seems like some groups are going deeper into denial rather than coming out of it. I don't know. I just wanted to hear what you think about that. Thanks.
Gosh. So a slightly jokey answer and then a serious one. So the jokey answer is, I think if you ask many people about the A22 network, their first response will not be, they are so easy to talk to and work with. Yeah. So how we see others, how they see us, it's not, it is often connected. And that's even more true if we're talking, for example, about differences of race within our movements in Europe at the moment, for example, particularly around Palestine. But the serious answer, so I don't know where SAFE, the Norwegian Offshore Oil Workers Union, is currently positioned in this. But in the first 15 years of the 2000s, they were a really strategic ally for us in Ireland in the battle against Shell. And we got through to them partly through Norwegian comrades on the very far left, people who would now be in Rødt, and partly through Irish social democrats of the worst kind, who, for various reasons, part of the thing that had Norwegian offshore oil workers at that point supporting a just transition was that they were keen to keep jobs on the Norwegian coastal shelf and did not want to see Statoil expanding abroad and basically becoming a multinational at the expense of kind of concentrations of Norwegian skill, which they thought could be converted for other purposes. Well, in much the same way, this is Terje Nystad's work, in much the same way that the Norwegian oil industry had partly been built up out of previous shipbuilding expertise. So they were keen to, that was part of their strategy. I don't say it's right. And I know that after that, the policy changed. But at the time, they were really useful allies, as were the much smaller and weaker group of the Ogoni in the Niger Delta. So an indigenous population famous to the rest of the world through the figure of Ken Saro-Wiwa, who was executed along with, 8 other people, as many of you probably know because he's been in the news recently. Those kinds of quite surprising alliances were useful for our purposes in Ireland. Yeah. What that particular union was willing to do in Ireland was quite helpful. And it was restricted. Yeah. Um, so sometimes you can start with something quite specific, like at the moment, resisting criminalization of activism seems really quite urgent in many different states, and it's something that affects quite a number of movements, including the Palestine movement, which at the moment is quite good at making coalitions. Yeah. They have quite broad coalitions between people who really fundamentally disagree with each other on many things. So sometimes you go, well, we're not going to agree on everything here, but we can have a short-term tactical alliance around this. And that can actually be quite helpful in building our capacity to make more strategic alliances. Because if we don't know how to make a short-term alliance around resisting repression, we probably can't make a long-term alliance for a different kind of society. Because it's a much easier goal and much more obvious, and there's a very immediate threat there.
Yeah, sorry, I just want to take questions from the chat. So Christian and Cien, I think they asked a similar question, which is how we can dialogue with each other or how we can engage with others.
In 50 words. I mean, so in the kind of training that we do in ULEX, we do start with this kind of exercise because since it takes time to reach out, yeah, it takes time to build alliances. It's a complicated activity. So if I'm trying to work, one of the things about trade unions is, I'm in a trade union, but they work in such different ways. It really takes time to understand, who am I talking to? What does it mean when they say these things? And to them, it's perfectly clear. But building that sort of understanding and then personal relationships so that you can say confidently to people in your organization, this is what's going on with these people. Also because quite often, so we're talking about this very particular union, you're making an alliance with one group within it. It's not homogenous any more than, let's say, Muslims is not a homogenous group at the moment when we're talking about Palestine or Islamophobia. So you are thinking, who is a useful person to talk to here? And it's not visible from the outside. It's not visible usually without time and energy. So prioritizing who to work with and mapping out what exists kind of go hand in hand a little bit as a strategic activity. And then looking for something which is closer to hand, either a threat, so criminalization and repression, they are a threat, or what is often quite good for climate movements over the last half century is place-based struggles. So when you are resisting a specific gas pipeline, for example, or as it was in the 1970s, a specific dam, yeah, in the north of Norway, or a specific nuclear power station, you can often build quite surprising coalitions with people that you never thought you could reach. So those are two areas, two kinds of spaces in which it's normally possible to build what I would call a shorter term coalition rather than necessarily a huge strategic alliance, but they often scale up into each other. So quite often the most ambitious alliances have come out of more specific moments because the crisis represented by, let's say, repression or a particular extractive project, a fossil fuel project, it speaks to other groups more directly than we can. They see it as a problem as well. So it's often a good place to start, in my experience. I'm not sure if that's a good answer to those questions.
Actually, if I may respond, because I asked one of the questions, is what you say is very praxis oriented. It's very focused on the particular activity itself. And you mentioned, I think, right in your answer in the beginning, that you do also have certain tools or that you practice in order how to engage with others. And I'm wondering is how embedded is that that practice that you do of engagement, of conversation, in the very foundation of how you see yourselves as a group, how you engage with people in general, maybe your worldview as well.
Um, Gosh, I think these are skills that everybody can learn. Um, but I think there is also a kind of there's a sort of activist biography in which often people first have to become good at the thing that their group does, and then become good at speaking to very different kinds of groups. Um, and sometimes it's really strange. So in Ireland, we defeated nuclear power. Apparently, a key moment in this was when local people in a very conservative rural area saw that the environmentalists also had kids. So you can imagine in the 1970s, they were turning up with children, they were trying to look after them in fields in the middle of nowhere. And that was comprehensible to people. And they started saying, do you need food? You know, would you like to come in and change your baby? Or would your kid like to come and play here? So, quite surprising. But I was talking, Christian, to somebody last week who is in Gas about their actions against Israeli arms shipments in the port of Rotterdam. So coming out of climate activism, they'd been trying to target the port and finding it very difficult on a climate basis. It was quite resistant. But when the issue became one of arms shipments, docking unions have a long history of international solidarity and specifically of refusing arms shipments to Israel. And they understand that other dockers are doing that around the world. So they managed to make that connection, and as I understand it, connections to the Muslim community for obvious reasons, but also to other people in Rotterdam who felt quite involved in the port being a significant part of local identity. So partly it was finding that, and you might try three or four things and then go, oh, this one people respond to that. This one, people will connect with us. But the previous efforts, they're not wasted. So I spent a long time organizing with working class community groups in Ireland. I'm very visibly and audibly not working class. But every time I failed, I went back and went, how did they see me? What did they hear? So if you want a short answer, it's taking yourself away from the center and trying to imagine who is the person that you are talking to. But yeah, it takes time, right? It's a maturing skill, and I'm not hugely good at it. But you don't have to be totally good at it for people to see that you're making an effort and that you're trying, and then they can choose to try back or not. Yeah, and I mean, this is also what we're doing, right? And it's what you're doing as Resilient Uprising, to some extent, as I understand it. Bear.
Yeah, I'm like quite new in my networking activity in the Italian project. And I'm realizing that it's really important to maintain that personal continuity. So it's really difficult to change roles when it's about relationships with other groups. So as you said, it takes a lot of time. And I'm realizing that it's much easier for me to do it, for example, in my city, because people know me from the past or they know people that knew me from the past. And it's really a matter of knowledge of your territory in the social sense. So yeah, I'm reflecting on how it's important to maintain roles in years and not just in weeks or months. And also, I am thinking on how it's maybe difficult for immigrants because they don't have that relationship rooted in the territory, and we are projected in a dynamic where migrations are going to be bigger and bigger and bigger, and this makes really maybe difficult for those people to be effective also because they are in a space that they don't know or in a social space that they don't know.
Mm. All of this is true. And, Marian's comment in the chat is true. And, some of the other discontents. One of the difficulties of these kinds of conversations is I often feel almost that I'm trying to sell something, and that's very unhelpful, because it's more like if we want to win, we have to learn how to do this. We need each other. We Because we do not have the formal political power that the other side has. We don't have the extreme wealth that they have. And we don't have the same sort of kind of, cultural power very often in all sorts of ways that they have, normality, race, gender, and so on. We need each other. And it's really difficult. And we have no real choice. So that's why I'm keen not to be too. I don't want to say this is easy. It's not easy, but we also don't necessarily have much choice, other than to do a bit. And sometimes when you do a bit, people really, really respond, and it's extraordinary. And you come to know people that you would never have known before. it's fantastic. And when there is a crisis, they know you. Because this is the other aspect of what Bea is talking about, building relationships over time in place, is that other people see you and something happens, because we know that the other side, they move fast and break things, as they say. So very often there's a crisis. And these relationships, the work that we do in a slow way, becomes really helpful when you go, who can I call right now? Because we've got a real problem. Yeah. Who do we know?
I would like just to add to that, if I may, is that exactly that one of the things that I do appreciate since I've been following these sessions, and I really appreciate your efforts, Bea, for what you and your team are doing because it has been connecting me at least. I'm sure that for everybody else is also the same, getting to understand exactly what everybody has been doing, not reinventing the wheel, picking up from what other people have been doing, have been learning, and I do think this is what we should be doing, and eventually, I do believe that in the future, we will be sowing the seeds of what you guys have been doing primarily, because I see myself as just a novice herein. And you were talking, Laurence, about Tegengas, and exactly, it's Tegengas members are also in our group in Rotterdam, and exactly, it's been really gratifying seeing the kind of effects that's been having on the municipality of Rotterdam in order to change their policy towards Maersk, at least the harbor. And one of the things that we're trying to do as well is trying to connect more to the labor unions in the port, seeing that as a very important node. And in our movement, we are connected to XR, to Tegengas, to Fossil Free, to all these different things, all these different movements, because we really believe that it's all the diversity of these movements that we need, so we don't have that what I've been hearing examples of people going from one movement and completely to another thing and then leaving the other one behind. No, to actually try to see how all these things fit together. So everything that I've been learning from these sessions, Bea, definitely is things that I'm bringing over to my group in order so we take into account in how we form ourselves, our structure, the values, and everything that we're doing. So thank you very much for all your work.
That sounds like a good note to end on then. Yeah. You're part of this project that you're all doing together seems really, really valuable, and it's just delightful to see it, actually. Yeah, and I hope it goes well. I know you're now taking stock after a first module of it. So, yeah, I'm sure some of us will meet again on different screens or in different places soon enough.
Okay,